Toad goes under cold stones, days and nights are 31.
Sweltered venom sleeping got, boil thou first in the charmed pot.
Eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog.
Adder's fork and blindworm sting, lizard's leg and owlet's wing.
Nose of Turk and Tartar's lips, severed in the moon's eclipse.
Village of a penny snake, in the cauldron boil and bake.
Those were the witches from Roman Polanski's 1971 adaptation of Macbeth. They look pretty much exactly like you would expect a witch to. They're stooped, warty, and wild-haired crones crouched over a steaming cauldron, and the charm they're making is a prototypical witch's salve. According to historian
Michael Ostling,
in the times of the witch trials, witch's salve was believed to be made of
the cooked fat of murdered babies, often mixed with the sort of thing you might expect: bat's blood, the tails of lizards, the eyeballs of toads, right? Yeah. So all of these are disgusting mixed in with that baby fat, and that's how they flew.
Obviously, this is not true, and so-called witches did not boil babies to make flying lotion. And as a matter of fact, this kind of negative propaganda was usually initiated by witch hunters.
So the idea that witches fly was a fantasy, and it was a fantasy about female freedom, because women are confined to the home, especially at night. And so if you are imagining women doing the things they're not supposed to do, then there's a series of things that you're going to imagine them doing, which are all the opposite of what they are supposed to do. So if a good woman is supposed to stay at home, a witch leaves the home. If a woman is supposed to be modestly dressed, a witch is naked. If a good woman is supposed to be a mother and nurture her babies, a witch kills babies and uses their fat to fly.
Although witches did not make salve out of fillet of a finny snake and bat's blood, some ethnobotanists and chemists do believe that a kind of witch's salve is in fact a historical reality.
And so these chemistry professors say, I've got to figure it out. They had a hallucinogenic trip, and here's the proof. And they always give the same story, which is about the solanaceous alkaloid, right? Alkaloids derived from the nightshade family. The main ones are the nightshades: belladonna, henbane, datura, and a few others. And so these chemists or pharmacologists say, look, these plants are hallucinogenic, which is true, and the witches could have mixed them with a fat or an oil as a good carrier. They often say that the broomstick was an applicator, and that the witches would introduce the broomstick smeared with this ointment into their vagina or anus.
If this theory has the backing of chemists and pharmacologists, then obviously it makes chemical sense. So how exactly would this salve recipe and application work on a chemical level? Let's look a little closer. A salve is a chemical solution, and our witch's salve is a solution which contains psychoactive nightshade extract solutes dissolved in an animal fat solvent. The solute is the component of a chemical solution present in a smaller amount, and the solvent is the component present in a larger amount. When a substance dissolves or goes into solution, that means that each individual solute molecule is surrounded by solvent molecules. So picture one nightshade extract molecule surrounded by animal fat molecules. When the solute and solvent are separate, then solute molecules only interact with other solute molecules, and solvent molecules only interact with other solvent molecules. But when the solute dissolves, then the solute molecule only interacts with the surrounding solvent molecules. These forces of interaction between molecules are known as intermolecular forces. A solute will only dissolve in a solvent when the intermolecular forces between the solute and solvent molecules are about equal to or greater in strength than the intermolecular forces between a solute molecule and another solute molecule, and a solvent molecule and another solvent molecule. Otherwise, the solute would rather interact with itself than interact with or become surrounded by / dissolved in the solvent. In the case of our witch's salve, the solvent is animal fat, which is made up of extremely non-polar lipid molecules. The intermolecular forces between non-polar molecules are the weakest, and they are called London dispersion forces. They're caused by the very weak charge disparities, or dipoles, within a single nonpolar molecule, caused by random movements within that molecule's electron cloud. The temporary dipoles, or opposite charges within the molecule caused by London dispersion forces, will fleetingly attract nonpolar molecules to each other. Polar molecules, on the other hand, have permanent dipoles, caused by differences in electronegativity between atoms within a single molecule that permanently warp that molecule's electron cloud to make one side of the molecule more positive and one side more negative. The dipole-dipole intermolecular forces between polar molecules are much stronger than the London dispersion intermolecular forces between nonpolar molecules. This means that if you drop a polar solute into a nonpolar solvent, the intermolecular forces between the polar solute molecules will be much stronger than the intermolecular forces between the polar solute and the nonpolar solvent molecules. Thus, the solute would rather interact with itself than with the solvent, and it will not dissolve, but will instead aggregate. That is, polar solvents will only dissolve similarly polar solutes, and nonpolar solvents will only dissolve similarly nonpolar solutes. From this, we can derive the chemical maxim, like dissolves like, or only molecules with similar polarities will dissolve in each other. Going back to our witch's salve, the theorized solute of our salve is the psychoactive components of nightshade extracts, compounds known as the tropane alkaloids. Tropane alkaloids are indeed nonpolar. Theoretically, they would, and in experiments do, dissolve in the similarly nonpolar animal fat solvent. Additionally, our body's mucous membranes are barriers of nonpolar lipids, and these membranes include the vagina and anus. So the salve would, and experimentally does, absorb/dissolve through these membranes into the body. And when I say experimentally does, this is confirmed because one French professor in the 60s did indeed experiment on himself with a potential witch's salve recipe. That is, chemically, as many a scientific scholar has pointed out, hallucinogenic witch's salve makes perfect sense. However, just because a theory is biologically and chemically justified does not mean there is a strong body of historical evidence to support it. And indeed, this is the case when it comes to witch's salve.
And because the belief in a witch's ointment was part of the belief in witches, and because people who are being tortured do tend to whatever they are asked to confess to, it is very common for accused witches to confess that they flew and that they used an ointment. And what we know is that, as far as we can tell, no accused witch, of which there were probably something like 80,000, ever confessed to using the nightshades in an ointment for a hallucinatory trip. So we actually have zero historical evidence for this.
That is, although it has a lot to teach us chemically, hallucinogenic witch's salve is ultimately just as much a myth as evil curses made of baby fat by old withered crones. Although the truth might not be as romantic as the myth dreamed up by so many scientists, Dr. Ostling makes the point that telling it is ultimately more respectful to those lives tragically lost during the age of witch hunts.
It is very tempting to take this period of European history that is so exotic and so interesting and exciting and spooky, and which can be bent in directions which make for useful stories for all kinds of people, for neo-pagans, for some kinds of feminists, for pharmacologists and ethnobotanists. It's very tempting to bend their stories to our needs. And I understand it to be an important part of my work, and I think many historians of witchcraft would agree that the best way to honor the deaths of the 40 to 60,000 women murdered for a crime they did not commit is to represent their lives accurately. That means, in some ways, making their stories a little bit more boring than they originally seemed.
And on that final note, thanks for listening.